Well, yeah, thanks for inviting me to do this too, Rudy. I'm a huge fan of like I've been so into AI and LLMs since I since I really first started playing with GPT-4. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about my sort of aha moment later on. But I'm definitely at that stage where I love to gush about this stuff to anyone who will listen. So this is fun for me too. All right. So first off, yeah, we're going to be talking a little bit about how you just get the most out of like GPT and Copilot and that kind of thing, um, and maybe give y'all some ideas for how you can be using it better as individual engineers. Um, so a little bit about myself first, right? So who am I? Former Army engineer. I'm not the kind that built bridges or did anything smart. I just blew stuff up, and right. And the nice thing about blowing stuff up is you can always throw more explosives on something, and it'll just blow it up more, right? So you don't have to be very smart to figure that out. I got out, and Bailey, who had worked there at Yeti, she talked about how she'd gone through one of the early coding boot camps, and I was sick of what I was doing too, so I decided to go to coding boot camp. And then I got picked up at Microsoft shortly afterwards. Worked there for about 5, 6 years, and I finished up my time there as a tech lead. I was heading up development of a few AI-based products across teams in Redmond, the Shanghai area, and in Prague, right? And so that was something really fun for me. And now, of course, I'm working as I'm leading engineering on my own AI-based startup, and a large part of that is just because of how much I've really been enjoying working with AI. It's super fun, real interesting kind of stuff. Um, so uh, before I really get into like the meat of how I how you can use it or how I use it. And talk a little bit about like what really gave me that moment where I suddenly realized like, wow, this is something I need to be using and I can really gain so much more power out of it, right? So earlier this year, wife and I we had our first child, right? And I go away on on like parental leave, and this is like the first quarter of 2023, right? So earlier last year, I should say. And that was around the time that like GPT-4 came out, right? And I remember my team, we were building this thing that was basically an automated data pipeline builder, right? So we just like y'all folks, I'm sure, got to deploy data pipelines every now and then, redeploying and rebuilding new data pipelines all the time. And this is something that, of course, as you get to larger and larger organizations, takes longer and longer to even do simple, basic stuff, right? And especially with all the security requirements and so on and so forth. So at Microsoft, like deploying these entire like large data pipelines and such, even though the transforms and the such, the individual steps, the code was relatively simple, all the steps of like the security reviews, every little thing that you were doing across that kind of thing, meant it could take a team of engineers like, oh, several months just to build and deploy a data pipeline, something like that simple. And we're like, wow, this is something we should be able to do quickly. We can throw together a few cloud products and we can basically build an automated data pipeline builder. But the big thing that we were running into over previous years, this is like 2022, was that, how do we actually do the code generation? And we were looking at all these different approaches, and we were thinking like, oh, we'll have templated code that plugs together and so on and so forth. And I went on parental leave right around the time we were starting to like talk to each other, and we're like, hey, there's this GPT-3 thing. Maybe we should consider like how we could code with AI. Um, and while I was on parental leave, I remember even playing around with GPT-3 a little bit. I was like, okay, neat. I mean, it's kind of cute, like, but I'm never going to do real coding with this. And I came back, and there was this mandate from up on high in Microsoft that basically said, like, every single team, stop what you're doing and figure out how you're going to go ahead and use LLMs and what you're doing. Right? Like, if you're continuing to do everything the old way, you're wrong. That's basically the mission. So my boss grabbed me. He's like, James, you're just getting back into things. And we now have to integrate LLM. So why don't you just become the person who like takes point? You learn all this stuff about LLMs. And I started looking at it and like, okay, cool. We'll do the coding with LLMs. But I remember getting this argument with my boss about just how accurate the LLMs were going to be and how much we could or could not rely on them for the coding. And I was talking to him and I was like, hey, Wei, you imagine that we're going to be able to go ahead and get like 90% of our code generated by this, and it's going to be like 90% correct. But it's what it's really going to be is like 70% of the time it gets it 70% correct, right? And like we're going to have to throw a lot of extra work into this, and went back and forth arguing about the design and of this product until finally he's just like, okay, James, you got it. We'll do it your way. And but I could tell he's reluctant about it. So I was like, you know what I'm going to do tonight? I'm going to sit down and I'm going to go into these AIs and I'm going to go ahead and run it through like 15 different situations, examples to show him how that I really am correct and could never do the kind of coding we needed to do. And I sat down and I ran through one scenario after another, and GPT-4 nailed every single one of them. It got every single one of them correct. And not only did it go ahead and get them correct, but it was giving me like alternative like architectures. It was giving me additional ways I could build this that I just never believed it could even get close to. And over, every single time, it was producing code that compiled and ran and worked, right? And I remember I literally took the entire like API contract I'd written, I took the entire like service architecture I designed, and I threw them away that night, wrote a big message to the team basically saying like, my bad, right? Like I was wrong about this. It really can do all this kind of stuff. And we redesigned our services starting that day, right? And I completely rewrote everything. So, I mean, the big lesson for me is a lot of folks I think have maybe played with GPT. If you played with just Chat GPT real quickly back in the day, you had this impression that, oh, well, it's a cool toy. And that's really kind of what it was. And if maybe you played a year or two ago or like, 12 months ago with like GitHub Copilot, you're like, cool toy, but I don't really need this. But GPT-4 is a huge step up. All right. It is, I get it. You might look at benchmarks and say, oh, GPT-4 is 95% accuracy on these kind of things, and GPT-3 was 80%. So it's not that big. It really is. When you actually start getting into the meat of this stuff, you'll be shocked by how accurate and how effective it is. But high level, the two things it does exceptionally well is one, it works as a great systems architect, and two, it's just a fantastic junior engineer, right? At this point, I'd say like the old concept with GPT-4, the idea of a junior engineer is effectively dead in mind, right? Not that junior engineers don't exist or shouldn't be hired any longer, but what we used to think of junior engineers being able to do should completely change, right? Because every junior engineer now has a junior engineer in their pocket, okay? A very fast one at that, meaning that you all, if any of you are juniors, are essentially empowered to basically rise up to the level of what a mid-level used to be. And mid-levels in turn are able to step up themselves. So what are the things that LLMs can really do for you in specific terms, right? So one, they're great at answering these sort of just stupid coding questions, right? The things that you used to like ask Google about all the time, right? And you go to Google and be like, man, I forgot how to format a string, right? In JavaScript. It's been like a year since I worked with JavaScript for some reason. I forgot something stupid. Or how do I manipulate arrays in, C#, okay? And so those little quick questions, it'll answer it faster and in more comprehensive and in context to what you're asking versus simply asking Google and taking a look at the document. Two, LLMs are fantastic at debugging, right? Y'all are all familiar with this process where in debugging, you'll start working on a problem and you don't want to bug, you kind of feel like you're already at a bit of a dead end, but you don't want to bug someone right away. So you spend some time working at it, and maybe you tease up a few things on Stack Overflow, and you're able to kind of like make a little bit of progress. And finally, after 3-4 hours, you go like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and bug Sandy. I'm going to bug Susan or whatever, and we'll see if they can help me out. The nice thing, of course, about GPT and these LLMs is you can bug them right away. You're not actually bugging anyone. And where they're really great is because you have to spend a little bit of time like actually explaining the context of your problems to them for them to really understand, they work exceptionally well for rubber duck debugging. Okay, and we'll get into each of these points in greater depth in a little bit. Three, it's really great for walking through new code bases or code bases that you've just been exposed to, right? I'm sure all of you are familiar with this problem where like, hey, you've been moved onto a new project and here's this code base. It's 100,000 lines, okay? And your first week or maybe 2 weeks on the project is literally go through the tutorials for this language or this library and just try to like walk through that code base and try to figure out what it's even doing, right? LLMs, you all know, and I'm sure you've seen about how they can like summarize stuff real quickly, but they're great at summarizing code bases and walking you through them in a point-by-point way. They're also great, of course, for learning new libraries. We'll talk about that in a bit. That rapid low-level coding, like I said, you all have a junior engineer at hand with the advantage of LLMs. And then for higher level stuff, for those of you who are mid-level or seniors or anything like that, where they're really helpful is in terms of architecture questions, decisions, and your technical writing. So things like churning out quick API contracts, that kind of thing, and even coming up with your service flow diagrams and such. I'll show you some of that later on, show you just how quickly that can be generated with the help of these LLMs, right? So let's go through these sort of like point by point, right? So stupid questions, like I said, right? So this is stuff like refamiliarizing yourself with or learning a new language or framework. And like I said, there's 1,000 of these questions. People are always joking, like, oh, Google's the real engineer here, blah, 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 right? All that kind of stuff that you would have been asking Google, you can just very quickly ask GPT and you'll get the full range of answers. So, like I just did a quick example over here. I asked it, what are my options for string formatting in JavaScript and what's considered the most clean code way, right? And so like, not only does it understand sort of these things of like, what are your options, the pure documentation, but it's familiar with, coding best practices. It's familiar with what you can or should not be doing. And you can see like in this one example, one case it gave me tons of examples. It identifies that using template literals is generally considered the most readable and clean code way to do it. But you've got concatenation, you've got array.join, you have string replacement. In fact, we can go here and I think it even identifies a few things for like internationalization and localization and string formatting libraries, things that I wouldn't have considered, but understanding those as options, maybe that's the kind of thing that actually ends up being relevant to you, right? We go on to like the next thing, of course. So that's, I would say, sort of like the easiest, simplest one. I just re-engage from here. I'm going to start from there. I guess I'm just doing it like that. All right. So debugging. This is one of the areas where I think that just about everyone should be able to save literal hours with the advantage of LLMs, right? Like, I know I save hours of work in debugging with the help of a GPT. And really, it's just a matter of you run into a problem, you give it a little bit of context, you share a bit of the code that you think is like relevant to it, right? And you give it the error, and then you say, like, this is the problem, this is what I'm running into. Maybe this is what I think might be the issue, and ask it for some help. Like what's going on, right? Like I'll literally ask it like, what do you think the problem might be? Are there any, like what troubleshooting steps would you recommend? And it'll give you pointed in context troubleshooting steps, right? So this is actually, I think this is actually a screenshot I did from a bit of code I was attempting to troubleshoot a while back, right? So I was like, why am I getting this particular error when it comes to my default credential strings? There's some additional context up above, right? Where I'd given it some of my other code and I explained why I knew it wasn't just a pure simple credential issue and that kind of thing. And it was based on my earlier context and based on the error I actually received, it was able to give me some in context debugging and troubleshooting solutions. And so again, you'll often find that as opposed to, I know a lot of like senior engineers will have like a rule, or they'll say like, hey, make sure you try to work at a problem for like an hour before you take it to someone else, right? So that you're learning a little bit and that kind of thing. Things like that. There's no need with LLMs to work at a problem or hack at it for an hour. It's if I've been stuck on something for even 5 minutes, I'm going straight to the LLM. I'm dumping my information in there and I'm trying to have it help me get answers. Okay. In fact, I'd say that's just a sort of great rule of thumb. Debug for 5 minutes, then ask GPT. Over this last summer, I had a couple, senior level interns here at Microsoft, and I remember we had a few times where I was, of course, always encouraging them to come talk to me, right? But the first few times they brought issues to me where they asked me to help them debug. What I literally did is, I wasn't familiar with their code at first, right? Like they're working on a new thing. I'm having them explore some new libraries and such. I literally take their code, take all the things, and right in front of them, I'd screen share, and we just dump the question into GPT, right? And after like the first 10 or so times where they saw me like literally go there and get the answer, not from me, but they're over there wording the question for me. I'm typing it into GPT and they get the actual answer. They realize, wow, I don't need this dumb senior James to help me answer things, right? Like I have GPT, okay, and it's basically I've got this senior I can turn to at any given point who can help, right? And of course, that it's also another great way for you to that bit of um, imposter syndrome. You're like, man, I don't ask a dumb question. There's no dumb questions. You're never going to be ashamed or embarrassed to ask GPT something, right? And it also helps you know that like by the time you do come to someone for help, you can say, yes, I've already been through these 5, 6 standard troubleshooting steps. Okay. All right. So walking you through code bases. You can do this just by copy pasting code into like something like ChatGPT. But this is actually where GitHub Copilot and Copilot Chat are probably the real big champs here. I would generally say to use ChatGPT for most things because it has the longest context right now because it's using the 128K token context thing and it's a bit faster and so on and so forth. But GitHub Copilot, where it's really great, is it actually is constantly as you're working in say like VS Code or something like that, it's constantly reparsing your code and like re-summarizing it internally, right? It's always learning your code as you're typing it through it and that kind of thing. And that means even if you open say a new repo, it's learning and understanding that repo, right? So you have the advantage of you can go into this new code base and you can literally just say like, hey, explain the flow of how this call is actually doing Y process, right? Like, you've got this insane structure of dependency injection, and there's 5 different, internal libraries that's relying on so many things where you'd normally have to be looking at references for hours just to kind of understand what this one like 5-line utility function is doing, right? Because it's just nested dependencies and nested libraries and such. And instead, you can have GPT walk you through that in 5 minutes, right? So even something like this I'm asking to explain what this split and compressed docs method is doing, right? This is like a huge Mondo method we have in like our POC code, right? It's like 100+ lines long, and it's calling like 10 or so different other, helper functions. It really is something that we should, refactor, that kind of thing. In fact, we are right now, but like someone sitting down there and just looking at that code, it would be like terrifying to try to parse their way through. But here it is. It breaks it down for me in 9 steps. This is what's actually going on and how it's working. And this is what is happening at each of these points, right? And you could even ask it, to go back through and help you like, write up comments or tell me, give me the line numbers for each of the points where something like this is happening. So having a tool like this to very quickly help you walk through a code base, huge win. Okay, learning new libraries and tools. Again, another thing, sort of like walking through a code base. It's just great to have something that you've been told, cool, go work with WebSocket, and it's your first time ever working with WebSocket. Go work with SignalR. It's your first time ever hearing the word SignalR, right? And like, so you're going to sit down and normally the way you used to do this is you just go to their documentation and you would just spend the day reading it. Okay, and then you'd for the next few days, maybe you'd struggle a little bit through as you implement some of the tutorials and um, some of the code samples, and then play around with it and get things working. You don't need to do that anymore, right? So long as the library you're using is within the current training horizon, which is April 2023 right now, right? And so long as there haven't been any like big breaking changes since then, you're likely going to be able to use this to walk you through these new libraries, to tell you how to use them, and to even write tons of sample code for you, right? It'll generate solid code samples. It'll explain the docs, to you, and it'll explain them with context to your problem. So if you say like, hey, I need to use this library to do X, right? One, you can ask it, are there any other libraries I should consider, and what are the pros and cons of them, right? But two, if I'm using them, like, what are the things I need to know about this library, right? Can you write me some sample code for sections of, for doing X, Y, or Z? And then as you're writing, as you're going ahead and working with the library, instead of constantly having to refer back to the docs and figure out how these 10 different classes in it function together, you can instead just be going ahead asking GPT, like, what do I do with the library at this stage? I want to do X, Y, or Z, and can you write the code for me to do that? And they'll usually do that pretty well, so long as it's a simple problem. And this is a case where I was looking to implement celery workers for Django for the first time, right? Hadn't worked with Django in a quadrillion years. Come back to it for first time in like 5 years, and now I'm asked to go ahead and implement some celery workers. And so I'm like, just explain them to me. Like, what the heck are celery workers? How do I do it? What are they used for? That kind of thing. And then now I can sit there and evaluate like what sort of message broker I want to use. And then later on, in fact, I asked it for give me all of my initial like framework code so I can go ahead and add this to my code base, right? And so this kind of stuff, again, huge, huge time saves constantly and all over the place. Rapid low-level coding. So it's great at banging out quick code, right? Like I said earlier, it's generally where this is great is if you know you have a simple task, you could do it, but it's one of these things where you just have to like spend a little bit of time thinking about like, how exactly am I going to work it out? How am I going to do this? GPT can just bang that out for you. There's no reason you should be writing simple stuff. Anything that you're like, wow, this would be like 20 lines or less, okay, and more or less straightforward. I don't need some like incredible computer science approach to this, right? And some insane algorithms approach, and even some of the insane algorithms approach, it's going to be able to do that really well. Like I said, it's your personal intern, it's your personal junior engineer. And this is, again, a really great example, right? Like the other day, I wanted to make it create a GitHub Actions YAML script, right? That would open an issue in our Kanban anytime Dependabot opened a pull request, right? I know I can go through and go through the GitHub Actions docs and figure out how to write that, and it'd be pretty straightforward and simple, and I'd write in an hour or so. Or I could just ask GPT, go ahead and write this for me. And it turned out that entire script instantly inside of a minute, right? So now I just have this. It's done. That's an hour of my time saved right there. Or, for someone who isn't familiar with GitHub Actions, this would be hours. This is a day of their time, right? And so, and there's another level to this, of course, and that's it crushes whiteboarding interviews. Okay. So, and I mean it really crushes. Go ahead and you can go to ChatGPT, GPT-4, and you can basically give it any question you would ever ask someone from like for an interview question, and it'll demolish it, right? Like I know a lot of folks, they go ahead and just go, oh, I'll just go to LeetCode and I'll get a mid-level, okay, maybe 2 mid-levels and 2 easies, and I'll see how that does. No chance, right? Literally, and I want to show y'all a good example what I'm talking here, right? So here's me literally copy pasting a LeetCode medium problem into GPT, right? I didn't even look at the problem, just copy pasted the entire thing in there, all the constraints, all the examples, so on and so forth. And I said, go ahead and solve this problem, right? And so what it did here is it explained its approach step by step of how it would solve it. And then where it says here, let's implement this in Python, then immediately afterwards it goes, the function works as expected. What you're not seeing here is GPT actually wrote the Python code for this first, and then performed code execution on its end, and then ran tests on it, okay? With these like various tests and some other ones that it constructed to make sure that the code it generated actually worked, okay? And then says, yes, it did work as expected, and here's what I use simple, and here's my outputs, and things work. And then it's like, cool, now just give me the Python code for it. Here it is. All right, I just crushed my coding interview. And I'm showing this to you not so that you can all go out there and say like, now it's time for me to land that sweet Google gig, right? They don't realize I'm gonna crush all their questions. But also this is kind of another like heads up to say like any hiring managers who are watching this and like who've taken that approach of, I'm just gonna go ahead, I'm gonna ask these standard like algorithms questions and these standard like whiteboarding questions, or just go to LeetCode or whatever it's going to be. That's going to continue working for maybe another few months before everyone else catches on to this, all right? Or until everyone figures out ways around getting around your cool special, locked out, you have to code in it special frame that you set up for your interviews, okay? This is just so simple. It's like while I'm taking notes during an interview, I can be writing down these interview questions and just crushing it, just plugging it straight into GPT and let it give me the answer in the background. Okay. And so what I'd say, if you're a hiring manager, kind of think like, what does my approach potentially look like in the future if standard whiteboarding questions aren't effective tools to judge potential hires in the future? I don't have a great answer to that yet, but I'd say that's sort of up to everyone to sort of figure out on their own how they want to approach that. Let's see. Oh, what did I do? Oh, no on comment. Yeah. Yeah. So, again, mid-levels, seniors, even some juniors maybe, sometimes find yourself doing architecture and systems design. So again, GPT is great tool for this, right? Because you might have been doing this for a long time, but there's still always new cloud, like services that are available, new libraries, things like that are coming out all the time, and you might not be familiar with them all, right? But if it came out before April 2023, GPT does know about it, okay? And it can tell you what other people are saying about it, right? So when I'm building new services now, this becomes my first, my go-to architect for the first level, right? I'll literally just sit there and ask it, like, what are my options? Give me the pros and cons of each of these options, right? And it's again great. Like maybe you're used to working in AWS, you have to work in Azure or Google Cloud for the first time, right? Like now it can walk you through the services that are available in that cloud provider, right? So again, an example where I decided to go in and I give it basically, hey, I'm working in Azure with Django backend using LangChain for AI interactions. I'm building a chat bot, blah, blah, blah. I've got a bunch of long-running processes. What are my options for managing these long-running processes in Django or with various Azure services? As it turns out, I entered this one as an example, thinking I knew all the options I wanted. I was gonna I just wanted to show this to y'all. I was like, we were using Celery, and I was considering, I'd evaluated Azure Functions in the past. I was real familiar with them. I was like, I'd chosen, one over the other, and I'd chosen different options for a message broker with Celery and so on and so forth. And as it turns out, I'd never heard of Django background tasks, right? And that was, for us, the easiest and simplest and probably the most effective implementation. So asking this, literally prepping for this presentation a few days back, right? I was like, wow, cool. I actually was able to solve one of the things I was working on. And it was an architecture question I hadn't even thought to ask it beforehand, because I thought it was just so sharp and so on top of it for at least this particular problem, right? So right away you see things like that. Or, and this is the one that for some of y'all will be like, wow, oh my God, I can actually do this. So technical writing, API contracts, but not just contracts, but actual diagrams, service flow diagrams, API flow diagrams, that kind of stuff that like some of your managers and such, you'll spend a day or days on, okay, and writing and rewriting and reconfiguring that kind of stuff. It can literally generate it for you inside of a minute, right? So especially if you're doing any sort of diagrams like this, if you go to ChatGPT, they now have these things called GPTs, the GPT store, which is basically their version of like an AI app store. You just add one of these GPTs. I added the first one that popped up. I just searched for diagrams, right? And so I hit explore this stuff, and then I asked the question. I'm like, here, this is my service architecture, right? Or not my architecture, but here's like one of my my service flows, and can you go ahead and generate a service flow diagram? And it literally did it. Boom. This is exactly what I described, right? And normally this is something like, this isn't a tremendously difficult one, but I would still spend maybe 30 minutes, an hour doing that. And I take my API contract, and instead of going ahead and having to write all the contract out and that kind of thing, I'll literally tell it like, hey, I'm going to go ahead and design an API. Here are my user stories. Maybe I've written all my user stories out first, right? And I can say, now generate an API contract that would support all of those user stories. Okay, so if you're a PM, boom, now you're a PM that suddenly generated an API contract, and you can just send that off to the tech lead to evaluate and say like, cool. And it'll spit that out for you almost immediately. Office 365 Copilot can do this, but it limits its output to about a page or so of output. But again, this didn't cost me anything extra. I paid $20 a month or whatever for GPT Plus, and this was just there. I got to use it, $0. Okay, extra. So how much time would that save? For some of y'all, PMs and such, I imagine you're looking and going like, oh my God, my job's at stake. Okay, but the other way to look at it is like, now I'm like 10 times as effective, and I can churn stuff out that much quicker, right? And focus on the things I really want to focus on instead of generating diagrams. And little other things too, like I was just speaking with Amanda earlier, and I was like, so I didn't even include this, but I'm just thinking of it now, right? I was asking her to generate a mock-up for some new UI UX stuff we have going on. And one of the things I suggested is there are mock-up generators now where you literally go ahead and say, you type in the thing, a description of the website you want to build, and it like literally generates a front end for you. And you can click in an area and say like, can you put a modal here that has these fields in it? And boom, it generates an image of it. And then if you like the image of the websites generate, then you just hit another button and it generates the code and all the styling for that website, right? That kind of stuff, like that already exists. It's not like hypotheticals, all right? Just about anything that you're doing as engineers, there's something to make it go 10 times faster right now with AI for next to no money or no money. Okay, that being said, there are some limitations to be aware of course, right? So one, of course, is that April 2023 training horizon. There are some libraries that are either new enough or they're constantly in that much change that will be a problem for you. Maybe, but so long as you're aware of that, you can work around it, or you can understand, like, if you're aware of the limitations. Second one is the loss in the middle problem. And this is just a general limitation of how transformers work. The transformers are what power these LLMs, right? The longer your context, right? So the longer that chat session is, the sort of the less context they are able to preserve on what's there. Even if everything still fits within their technical context window, whatever that might be, like 128K tokens in the case of GPT-4 Turbo, which is like 50 plus pages of text, right? There's been a lot of studies to show that basically, for whatever reason, transformers are really great at remembering the very beginning of their context window and the very end of their context window. And the closer you get towards the middle of a really large context, the more fuzzy their memory becomes there, right? So as you start getting to these really, really large chat sessions, or if you start dumping in tens and tens of pages of stuff into GPT, it's going to go ahead and lose a little bit of focus on sort of what's in the middle. But again, if you're working with just a page or two of stuff at a time, you're not going to even begin to run into those kinds of problems. And finally, and this is one that's probably the most relevant for most folks, is going to be security for proprietary code, right? But there's ways to work around that. So first off, if you just want to stay inside of ChatGPT, I see a lot of companies going out there and going, oh, we're going to ban ChatGPT, we're going to ban AI, we can't trust their security and such. They've got privacy policies, they've got terms of service, just like anything else that defines what they will and won't keep. And so if they say they won't keep X data, they can't keep X data. So one of the things you can even do is, if you're on the premium account, you can turn off them maintaining training on your data, right? So they won't save any of their data back to OpenAI, right? So it's whatever, $20 a month. Now I can go in here to settings, go to data controls, and I can turn off chat history and training. All right. So if I want to plug something in, I'm a little afraid that, like, oh, well, this is technically proprietary code, shouldn't be shared outside of my organization. I just turn that off. No big deal. Boom, I'm done. And now I can continue to talk to GPT. None of that is being preserved. None of that is being used. None of that's being trained on, right? And if you want to just be extra secure, generally, I just make sure you're filtering out any sort of like PII, EUII, and like not including that. And then you can feel extra confident. Beyond that, though, you can also just stick with GitHub Copilot and GitHub Chat. Those already do not train, like that's part of their thing. And then the other final option, and this is something I did a lot at Microsoft because we were ultra afraid, I guess. And I would just go into, because we had instances of GPT-4 in Azure, I'd go to our Azure OpenAI instance, and I'd go to the playground there, and the playground is just a GPT-4 chatbot, and I just go talk to that. That would be my chatbot there, and I could dump whatever I wanted into there, knowing that I could even dump PII in there and no one would care, right? It's not being trained on, it's not being used anyway, it's completely 100% Azure secure or whatever. So if they're comfortable with us doing our stuff in Azure already, then they're comfortable with me using the playground. So basically, for every single option that you would be using AI, there's options to either make it so you can feel comfortable security-wise with proprietary data, or with whatever it is you're using, or there are alternatives you can use so that that's never even a sticking point, never even a question. So that's everything. I know I went on for like an age there, just nonstop me, but I guess now I imagine some of y'all have questions. If you do, hit me.
I'll just say that was great. I'm glad we recorded it because of all of your specific examples. I'm sure some people have questions, so feel free, anyone. Fire away.
I have one. Well, I have a few, but I'll start with one. So when you're generating code and responses back from ChatGPT-4 or Copilot or whatever, what level do you audit that code coming back? Like, so let's say, it compiles and runs as you expect, but do you still like go through line by line, make sure there's nothing funky happening, or what level of trust do you kind of put into the integrity of the code?
I guess it really depends on the coding question, right? Like, it's going to be like, I would literally answer that with, again, think of it as you have like a senior level intern or like a new junior engineer, and you ask them to write that for you. Like, what level of auditing would you apply to that? Okay. So if it's a simple util function that you're just going to like assume that they're a smart, capable person, they're able to write that, and you wouldn't really give it a super dense audit, then same thing, right? And versus if it's some security critical thing, you want to make sure they didn't screw it up or whatever, and you would really pay attention, then likewise. I did the same thing with GPT. It really is useful to just think of it like, say, I have a junior engineer here. That's what it is.
I have a question about, it was more just a thought while you were speaking. What do you think the role of documentation is going to become? Because it seems as though if we're all able to rely on this chatbot, the act of writing and consuming documentation becomes like more of a machine to machine thing. I'm curious if you have thoughts about like what that
It
means.
kind of, yeah, yeah, absolutely. So one, documentation still serves a purpose, just like I think Johnny mentioned, for the purpose of just like an audit, right? It's helpful sometimes for me to go back through and like, after I've had it, if I'm working with, say, a new library and I've had it do something that I think is maybe a security critical or is going to be potentially like memory or CPU constrained, I'll go back through and I'll take a look at the documentation to make sure that the way it's doing it is the most sensible way to do it with that library or something like that, right? So that's level one of it. But two, I definitely agree that I think increasingly documentation will be written by LLMs and it will be intended to be read by LLMs. And I can tell you, without going into specifics, some of the projects I was working on inside of Microsoft, we were basically writing documentation meant to be read by LLMs. Okay. And in some cases, it was the LLMs writing that documentation. So that absolutely will be the case. And like writing it for LLMs, you definitely it's like you have to go back to everything you learned about tech writing and that kind of thing, and realize you have to be very specific and very careful with your wording because GPT and these LLMs, they will take you very literally, right? If you always say like, you should always do X first, it will always do X first, even if it doesn't make sense in that case, right? If you really mean you should generally do X first, right? But there are exceptions, you need to be careful to write that kind of thing. So there are things like that like areas where I think documentation will become a little bit more verbose than it is right now, so that it can be read and understood extremely well by the AI. But again, the other thing though is as these LLMs just get smarter and smarter, the need to do these kinds of things and to work around their peculiarities, I think is also just going away, right? By the time we see like GPT-5, like it's just going to be basically as smart as anyone else out there and be able to infer the meaning of these documentation as well as any human would. So you might get some extra verbose documentation just for it to train on, but I don't think that we'll necessarily see it change too much. What else?
I'll ask what is probably the inevitable question in a group like this. So, at what level do you see? So right now, I think it's being characterized as like, this is a great assistant, somebody you can help, that can help you work with your code and make good decisions. What do you see like as the iterations of these things come out, ChatGPT 5, whatever, what will be the role of an engineer in architecting, implementing, coding a code base or a project? Is it going to be an increasingly like a partnership with the LLMs, or do you think there's some type of limitations with LLMs that maybe are not a limitation on human intellect that will still have a relevant role?
I think so. Being honest, one of the reasons I decided to create a startup recently is because I was sitting there looking at what I was doing, and I realized like, oh my God, I won't have a job in 4 years. That's really what it was. I looked at it, it's like there's nothing that I do right now that this in 4 years will not be able to do. And I'm literally was over there like here I was talking about like doing a data pipeline builder, right? That could take these pipelines that we'd have a team build in 3 months. And literally the requirement was that a PM should be able to go in there and with natural language generate that pipeline in under an hour. That's what we were building towards. And we'd already gotten it to under a day. Okay, the PM could do that. All right. And so I was looking and saying like, yeah, right now it is definitely a partnership, and every single engineer is 10x an engineer, right? You should be maybe not 10x, but you should be that much more capable. But there will come a time where I'm not sure that necessarily every engineer is going to lose their job. But what I will say is I think that the job, what it means to be an engineer will change, and it'll increasingly change to being something that's more like a PM. Okay. I think that y'all find yourself doing a lot more just technical writing and writing out requirements and such over the years, like defining user stories and so on and so forth. And being just that auditing check, because just because you know the code might work and you really feel comfortable with it, that bank you're working with, they're still, working with 1980 software, so they still don't trust anything new, right? And so they still want to know that there's a person somewhere in the loop that understands the tech. So I think that's going to be what, like I said, oh, I'm not going to have a job in 4 years. I think I would have a job even as an engineer in 10 years still. But what I would be doing as an engineer would basically be auditing code and basically functioning as a PM to a bunch of these LLMs, I think.
I'm curious. I feel like everybody has their own way of using ChatGPT and like outside of work. I'm curious, do you have any cool ways that you utilize it just in like your daily life?
I guess a lot of folks, if you go through the GPT store, there's lots of neat little like things for managing your calendar, helping you bang out emails. Like one of the things before I even started using this for engineering, right? When I first got into this, I remember like basically going around to all my friends at like a party and basically telling them, if you've been dragging your feet on it, tomorrow when you go into work, make sure you're like spend your morning setting it up, because you will have paid yourself back that time by the time you leave that day, right? And a lot of these weren't engineers, right? I was just saying like, just writing your average emails and that kind of thing. I remember my sister-in-law, she didn't even have a job at the time, right? But stuff like just managing her emails to family, or like someone passed away that she didn't really know that well, but she still had to write a condolence letter to them. It's a little bit awkward. How do you write that weird condolence letter? And just dealing with it awkward, but she's just like, oh, GPT, like bang that out for me, and she was done with it already, right? So things like that, it can definitely speed things up and help you a little bit. I'm also just into like I use it as sort of like another great thing I find it's real helpful for is it's real helpful for as like memory prompting, I guess. I don't even know the term I would use. Like when you kind of remember some of the details about something, you're trying to look it up, but you don't remember the name of it. You don't remember the name of the song. You remember, one line from the lyrics or whatever it is. Or I was thinking of like this siege that I'd heard about the other day, like a historical siege. I remembered a lot of the details, but didn't remember the name of the siege. And I was like, well, let me plug it in. I described it, and it's like almost like a reverse research tool. So I think that's another way I find myself using it a lot.
So I imagine that we'll probably think a lot about this as like implementation of practices for the company and talk about it as a dev team, all that kind of stuff. But like when I log on to work on Monday morning, what should be like the thing that I should be immediately thinking, this is exactly what I should go to ChatGPT? Kind of like what's the biggest bang for your buck to immediately implement into your workflow for me, like a mid-level engineer?
Yeah, I mean, as a mid-level engineer, the first thing I would do probably, I would take a look at just, I'd go down and, assuming that the company's all right with it, I'd take a couple of my work items that I know I'm going to get next, and I just see like what can GPT do right off the bat with this work item, right? Like if I have a work item to implement this integration into this service, right? Like in this code, I just ask to go in there and say like, GPT, code this for me, write the class. I want it to be in this kind of way. I want you to use these coding best practices. Write up that description and see what it bangs out for you. And then that'll immediately give you an understanding of like just how powerful, just how useful is this going to be for you. Like, I say this is a junior engineer, but it's kind of like a little hard to say it's just that, right? Like sometimes it can do things where you're just like, ah, man, it's so stupid. It really screwed that up, right? But then other times you'll be like, oh my God, how did it just belt out like 3 pages of like perfect code for me, right? Like exactly what I wanted. That was like, that was the next week of my work, right? It's like half a sprint it just did for me. And so I think that the more you work with it, the more you get to, you'll start to get like the feel for, this is what it can do, and this is where I can really rely on it, right? And then even for some managers, there's going to be times where you'll be sitting there and like it's helpful for you to work with it and understand just how quickly you can churn some of that stuff out for your engineers, because then you can understand that like, this is what I might have given as a sprint in the past, but now a sprint can be this much more, right? You know, like it can really be that much more. And if they say this is going to take a week, then maybe that's just time to kind of sit them down and show them they can generate it in 5 minutes, and we'll do it together. Okay. And so I think that like just playing around with it and literally plugging the problems that you're working on into it will give you a fantastic idea of how helpful it can be.
We probably got time for like one more question or two if someone's got any. Or we might be done. Johnny, you have just a list you got going on over there. You've been asking good questions, so keep going.
Well, this one's actually kind of frivolous, but I was really interested. Do you know what level of availability this has across other languages? This is not particularly important to me as I'm a monoglot, but I'm just curious, like, can people immediately like hop onto ChatGPT in Spanish and German, Chinese, whatever, or do you know, is it kind of limited to English?
It is best at English. Okay. That being said, for things like engineering, for things like coding, it is basically like an ultra polyglot, right? Like you might be able to hit it with some, you know, very bizarre like language that you haven't heard of before. But certainly any of the things like if it's a language that that there's a good chance you know, where you've worked with engineers from that country, like it's going to speak that language, right? Like it'll handle Mandarin just fine. I'm sure the Cantonese just fine, Spanish just fine, right? It won't maybe know as much about other stuff in like just general other knowledge in those languages, but when it comes to engineering, it'll be just as robust. I'd say that, and it'll be a very effective. I mean, again, the first place transformers were used, even back in like GPT-1, GPT-2 type frame, was for translation purposes, right? And the first things that they were actually trained on before they were actually trained on, say, English or Spanish or whatever, is they were just trained on programming languages, right? Like because they are so heavily structured, right? So the one thing that they are kind of universal languages, right? These programming languages. So the thing that they're actually like absolutely smartest at and across any language is software engineering type stuff.
Well, sweet. James, this was great. Really appreciate you chatting to 15 random faces on Zoom about AI. So, we're really trying to make an effort as a company to level up. So this was awesome.
Right on. Yeah, it was a total blast. Thanks for inviting me to talk about it. Like I said, I got a little something out of it with that Django background task, so it worked out for me too. So thanks y'all. Hopefully all of y'all are able to go out and tinker with it a little bit this weekend or on Monday and have an aha moment and get blown away too.
Yeah. I'll let you know when we've got the video up in case you want to share it around to some people too.
Right.
And your
You bet.
work.
Thanks, Rudy.
All righty.
Cheers.
See everyone
Have a
later.
good weekend, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.